Man, it just it dang complicated, you know, man. Like a dang old Rubik's cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man. Then you get to one side, and it's like messed up.
All right, Samuel Urban, illegitimate scholar. How you doing, man?
Great, brother. How are you doing? It's good to finally come on here.
Yeah, definitely, man. I've been looking forward to this for a while. It's sort of embarrassing, but yeah, I kind of told you about this before we went live. I knew who you were. I knew your voice primarily from being on the Good Old Boys podcast, but I didn't connect the dots that the Twitter persona and your voice was the same person until we got a little bit further into this. But I'm really glad to have you on, man. It should be a good time.
Yeah, I've been thinking that I should maybe, match up illegitimate scholar with Twitter, which is Samuel Urban, if anyone else listening doesn't make the connection. But yeah, illegitimate scholar is my show, and my name is Samuel Urban. I sometimes go by Ill Scholar, Beastie Boys style. That kind of came around naturally.
So, for maybe some of my audience who aren't familiar with you, could you describe kind of who you are and what you do on the internet?
Yeah, so I'm I how would I define myself? I guess so. I do cultural anthropology. I like to sometimes half jokingly call myself the premier cultural anthropologist of the dissident right. And basically, I went to school to be a teacher after getting out of the Marine Corps. And I got my social studies certifications. I got a double bachelor's in history and anthropology, just because I love academics, as well as my bachelor's in teaching from the University of Connecticut, which is it's one of the most prominent teaching colleges, and that's not something I particularly value, but it is something that a lot of liberals value. On the internet, it's something I bring up, and it also allows me access to what was one of the most prestigious education institutions. So it's kind of like the top of the education stuff, which, in my opinion, really just results in having the highest concentration of applications of critical theory and things like that. So that was my experience there. I didn't enjoy it. I made waves. I upset people. Some for certain reasons that I deserved, some for others that I think were not legitimate. But I quit teaching, and I want to talk about cultural anthropology because it's my passion. So I create content on cultural anthropology from a right-wing perspective, because I think the field has incredible methodology and good roots, but has mostly been taken over by, the alphabet people and things like that. It's one of the most socially left-wing fields. It's like 97% left. So that's what I do. Dissident cultural anthropology. I like to talk about cultures. I like to talk about old anthropology. I sometimes go through anthropology and archaeology papers, and I call out BS in them. I talk about grave goods a lot, how archaeologists use grave goods for making these wild assumptions about a culture, stuff like that.
It's interesting, you bring that up because, like most people, I've only had one interaction with anthropology, right? It was an undergrad course, and it was taught by the most like absolute comical libtard you can imagine, right? The like very classic, kind of like aging flower child. And
Mm-hmm.
this would be a much funnier joke. I might pull this up, the photo that I'm referencing in the actual episode. But I remember sitting there, I was probably a sophomore in college, looking around the room and not particularly paying attention for obvious reasons. I'm like, what the hell? All these kind of like crude, hand-drawn, kind of like very childish drawings around, the room. And I look at them and I realize, oh, our final project is not a paper. It's a poster board for this college level anthropology class. And apparently I'm not the only person who realized this is something you were supposed to phone in, because you have adults right in their 20s using crayons and like, like art supplies for children to illustrate concepts from anthropology. And these were the ones, of course, that were deemed special enough to show off in class. And so I think that, my conclusion from that is that this field is a joke. And obviously that's unfair, right? This is sort of, I think that you're right to say that this field has been completely taken over by kind of the most liberal of the liberals. And so I'm curious, do you see that? When do you see that takeover starting? is it before other fields, or did it kind of hit in the 60s where a lot of other parts of academia were kind of undermined?
So there's two things. Number one, I'd like to just defend the contemporary anthropologists a little bit, in that the freshman and sophomore levels definitely have a lot of that, and that's terrible. But the 3,000, 4,000 level, like the senior level ones, they tend to be more academic, but you would never take those unless you were an anthropology student. But yeah, the shift I see happening, there's a few waves. So if you would bear with me, if I go back to the 1800s, there's like this old anthropology that is very tied into the British Empire exploration. It goes back before then, but this is like very tied in with imperialism. There's not a lot of good methods for it, especially with archaeology when they're digging things up. They don't preserve things very well, and that type of anthropology was it was very biased towards assumptions of ethnocentrism for European cultures. And I understand that what a lot of what I talk about is not ethnocentrism for European cultures. Like, I don't attack these things, but I think it's fair to say that it was ethnocentric towards European cultures. After that, you have this like 1890s to like World War II time, where I think the field really shines, and this is a field that has kind of separations in Europe and in the United States more so than other fields, based on anthropology in the United States developing alongside Native American tribes that were still around in the 1800s. The Indian Wars don't end until the 1890s into the early 1900s. So it's a different thing than anthropology in Europe, which has much more large scale ruins to look for. So in Europe, archaeology is actually separate from anthropology. It's its own field, whereas in the United States, archaeology is a field within greater anthropology, which is both a very broad field and a field that is very holistic, as in it deals with a lot of other fields. For example, a biological anthropologist will work a lot with a geneticist or something like that, or a biologist. A cultural anthropologist, like what I practice, we might talk to a sociologist, a psychologist, that type of thing. But with both the European and the American archaeology and anthropology, it is essentially, I won't even say the 60s, but I think post World War II. And I spoke with Stone Age herbalist, who's a very prominent dissident writer. He came on episode 42 of the Illegitimate Scholar podcast, my podcast. And we talked about this, is that there's this post World War II shift towards postmodernism. And the biggest shift that comes out of this post World War II shift, and that obviously in the 1960s, critical theory begins to infiltrate the social sciences, anthropology being one of the ones that goes first. So very deep in the 60s. But even before that, you have the hoax with Margaret Mead, which is pretty famous, that you and your listeners may or may not be aware of. And you do have the field beginning to go down before others do, basically immediately after World War II. Yeah, I think there was one other detail I wanted to touch on that, but I think that essentially answers your question.
It is interesting. I think that a lot of us, myself included, have had very, very negative interactions with the academy. You on Twitter, I think the day before this, discovered my kind of anecdote about getting taught a Gamergate class in college, right? Which, I'll be honest, is no small part of the reason that I'm here now. You go through that and you're like, well, okay, yeah. I didn't care before, but now I do. Whoever you hate, those are my friends. And so I'm curious, do you think that there is sort of a correction coming to the academy, or do you see that as being a system that's just almost unsavable at this point?
Well, so I talk a lot about social constructs, which tends to be a dirty word for right wingers, but essentially all social construct means is something that is created by humans. So how I like to describe it is that things that are innate and unchanging are things that are in the realm of God. They are not in the realm of humans, so they're not socially constructed. They're innate. They're unchanging. And there's two sides to this sometimes. Race, like your actual DNA, that is innate, but your race, as in the way that we think about race, like to decide that someone is black or white, requires a social construction. So that's a social construction. So I talk a lot about social constructions. All they mean is that it's created by humans. It's outside the realm of God. It's in the realm of humanity. And these institutions are social constructions. And they're social constructions that were born out of a certain context. They were created in, I think, the 1100s, 1200s in England, rooted in monastic traditions, created over time. You can draw a hard line at when the universities of Cambridge were created, and then in the United States with Harvard and Yale and Brown and Princeton, whatever. But they're still, they were created, and yes, they were new institutions, new social constructions, but they were also, they were an extension of past traditions that informed the decisions of the people that created them. And those institutions changed over time, and it's not like they've been in their current form for very long. And they're culture. They're social constructions. They are culture. And one of the traits of culture, which is something that anthropology deals with, cultural anthropology specifically, obviously, is that one of the traits of culture, one of the specific traits, is that it is changing. It is dynamic. It changes over time. So, for example, the University of Connecticut, where I went, was a farming institution when it was started in 1881. Harvard and Yale began as, which are in my region, New England. Harvard and Yale started as strictly teaching people to be religious leaders. I forget the name for that. And over time, they added schools and they changed. And the university system as it stands, I mean, is effectively modern to the 20th century. And this goes along with a shift in public education that is also something that changes in the 1890s into the early 1900s. It's standardized, bureaucratized across the nation. And that comes with a change in the university system. So we're dealing with a system that is ostensibly 1,000 years old. In its current iteration, 100 years old, if you can put some non-arbitrary number on it, which you kind of can't, but I guess we'll go with arbitrary and say 100. And the problems that we see happening are basically started in the 1960s, just like everything else that we see. So it's 50 years down, and whether they'll be salvageable, I don't know. But what I will say is that salvageable in the sense that they will serve some sort of other purpose in the future, I'm sure, whether that comes with significant reform that destroys the administrative state of these universities, or whether they turn into something else. It will be something else because culture changes over time, definitely. And the idea that their purpose has also changed over the last 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years. They served a completely different purpose 200 years ago. They will serve a completely different purpose 100 years from now than they do right now. So it's not a question of will it go back to normal, because there's no normal to go back to. It's just where they might change, what their position in society might change to. And that you'd have to put some other value on it, like with relevance to the society, with what they're producing being of value to the society. But all of these things change over time, and I don't think people really recognize how much they've changed. Yeah, I have a little bit more to say, but I've been talking for, I think, long enough.
I think about this in relation to sort of elite production, right? That you take something like the Ivies, and regardless of the stated purpose of that system, right? What the actual effect is that it was a finishing school effectively for the ruling elite, right? That you had if you were a betting man, you could pick the top half of any Harvard class and assume those guys are probably going to do something important. And again, as that stated purpose, right, which is an educational institution, has never really changed, but the effect, right, the output has a number of times. And I think that one of the things that we have to to kind of realize is how much the kind of combination of affirmative action state, right, that whole system, and then also the kind of attack on out and out nepotism, right, what that has produced. Because I think there's something to be said for the fact that these institutions were never like, there's this myth of pure merit-based admissions that's just kind of bullshit, right? Like, let's be honest, were all of those people in the Harvard graduating class of 1930 all of the smartest people in America? Probably not. It helped that they were from, certain families in the Northeast, very well connected, right? But at the same time, there was enough kind of social structure around that to ensure that there were kind of bans on both sides, right? Like, if you were too much of an embarrassment, you would be asked to go somewhere else, right? You were held to a standard. You see this in the admissions tests for a place like Harvard, right? That you were expected to be able to quote effectively from memory the classics, do relatively complicated mathematics. And so I think it's interesting that the stated goal, which was, oh, we will open up these processes to anyone, anyone who meets certain, kind of like objective standards, has not delivered on its stated goal, right? Which was to increase the quality of students, increase the quality of output. Instead, it has become sort of a political system. And again, I think that's sort of on purpose. That's a useful thing to have, to distort that, elite finishing to basically a reward system, right? That you get to go to Harvard. Like David Hogg is a good example, right? I am not on paper. I can't remember exactly what his SATs are. They're good, but they're not Harvard good, right? We know why he got in there. And so I think that that's an interesting development, right? That the idea of this neutral, purely like merit-based system is probably a myth. And when we tried to chase that, effectively all we did is take one biased system, replace it with another biased system, and also sacrifice the output to begin with. Sorry, that's a little bit rambly, but do you see what I'm getting at there?
No, yeah, 100%. And yeah, anyone familiar with my work is going to be laughing at that, for you saying I'm sorry for getting a little bit rambly, because that is my natural state. It's the way that I talk. I need to work on connecting ideas in my head a little bit better. But yeah, 100%, man. It's so Harvard and Yale, of course, but Harvard specifically. One stat that I like to say is that since I think Jimmy Carter, about 50 years, maybe right before Jimmy Carter, more than 50% of the cabinet of every single executive branch of a U.S. president, including Donald Trump, were from Ivy League plus schools. So more than half of the cabinet came from like schools like the Ivy Leagues: Brown, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Dartmouth, UPenn, plus like MIT and a few other good schools. It's like 20 schools, and there's like 1,000 in the US. And effectively, yes, there are standards, of course. I mean, during the 1600s, when Harvard was created, and Yale a few years later, they required you to speak and be fluent in writing Greek and Latin as a prerequisite to go there. And you went there at 14. So, I mean, they were getting the children of the elites, but they were not easy institutions. They were extraordinarily rigorous. But there's lots of these things in our society that are these stated purposes. And I think it has something to do with a culture of consumerism and euphemisms, and the way that, the way that the culture has developed in order to, it really seems to incentivize the people that can put something, when you send it to committee or to a focus group, that it has the best numbers, essentially. And I think that seeps into our language. A concept called hierarchical diffusion is something I talk about quite a bit. It's the way that culture is diffused or spread out from the upper class down. And I think that type of thing seeps into our culture. It's this HR language type BS. But really, these institutions have always been elite institutions that serve to preserve their prestige and the value of their institutions. So, we can talk all day about the theory of what it is, and they love to do that in public schools. They love to talk about theory and everything, but the system is what it does. And I think that it's much more accurate to call these places as, yes, educational institutions, but more so, really, they have consistently over the past hundreds of years been very good at promoting their own prestige and promoting the continued expansion of their institutions. And this makes sense because the incentive is tied in. The incentive to the individuals in these institutions, which is to grow these institutions, is matched with their own success. So their personal success is tied in with the success of the institution. If they increase the prestige of the institution, they increase their own prestige. And I think that social institutions that do this well are able to persevere and expand themselves because they sort of have a decentralized way of promoting themselves. And this is true of these institutions. Harvard promotes itself. They protect their image. They are very serious about that image. There are specific things about Harvard that I think someone like Chris Rufo, Harvard specifically. So Harvard and Yale are the first two, but Harvard specifically seems to be the one single target that's the most concentrated of these things. But they protect their own image. They always have, and they always will. And you can't find a lot of this information because it's not talked about because they protect their image so well. Does that make sense? Did I answer what you said?
No, it does. And I think if we're talking about education, there are a couple of things to talk about. So one of them is the point that Moldbug makes, right? Which is, if you ask someone, like, what's your opinion on Soviet science? Immediately you have that kind of qualifier that brings up red flags. And the point is, it was something put out by the Soviet government. It's not pure science, right? As much as pure science can exist. And I think that Burnham is very right when he points out that the Natsoks, the Russians and the Americans were all kind of doing the same thing in the 20th century, obviously with different outputs and different focuses, shall we say, but they were all kind of going about the same project of managerialism. And when you see higher education be brought into that system of government, right? Again, post World War II with things like the GI Bill, Moldbug's argument is that you should look at everything produced from that system in the same light as Soviet science, because it has that same kind of set of controls over top of it. And I think you see this in things like the replication crisis, right? Where there's a lot of money to be had by effectively coming up with some sort of experiment and selling it to the government as something that they need to pay for. And there's not a whole lot preventing you from effectively either doing the same thing over and over again or doing very shoddy science, because what all that matters, and this goes back to what your point is about the interest of the institution, and then just getting a giant grant for it, right? If you look at what is something most likely to get you promoted, right, at an institution, particularly a research institution, it's your capacity to, one, research, but two, get grants. And because these grants, some of it obviously goes to the research, but a large part of it goes to the institution. It's basically competing for government handouts, right? Getting free money. And I think what you see is, once you, even just from a market level, put that what's the phrase I'm looking for? Put that incentive out there, people will move in such a way as to take advantage of it. And I mean, I think that you look at something like Harvard, which is over $1 billion in their endowment, and that's a lot of money, but it's not orders of magnitude larger than other large institutions. And I think you see that effectively they no longer exist as educational institutions, right? They have that name, they have that skin, but they're effectively large conglomerates of people who basically are getting patronage from the government. And I mean, I think that's probably the best way to look at it.
Yeah, so I think that the way that education worked over time, obviously a bachelor's degree used to mean a lot more than it does today. A lot more people get bachelor's degrees. So I would say that I think they have always promoted their own prestige. This has always been an incentive structure. The way that it's been promoted has changed in the last 50 years, as you said. So it has intensified a little bit. But I would say that the idea that they're no longer educational institutions is, yes, I agree. I think they're even more so just networking institutions at this point. But I would say that I think that the arguing for prestige has always been there. The fighting for prestige has always been there. This is just a new iteration of it. And that the lack of the educational what's the word for it? Intensity. That's not the one I was looking for, but close enough. The intensity of that is probably mostly a result of just bachelor's degrees not really meaning much anymore, and they concentrate more on the master's, because they do tend to, from a research perspective, still attract. If someone is really doing good research, they're going to attract those PhDs to their universities. But of course, now doing good research means something different, because the incentive structure for what creates good research is a different thing. It's a lot. I would say it's more politicized because it's less concentrated on creating practical results that people can use, and creating concepts that people like engineers can actually apply and invent with. And it's a lot more concentrated on, these more prestige-based things. I think the rate at which that is a factor has increased quite a bit. And this coincides with our culture no longer really producing anything, I would say, in a lot of ways.
Well, definitely. And again, some of that I think is just kind of natural decay of empire, right? Any society kind of goes through, some semblance of that. I do think that the incentive structure also has produced that, right? When you are rewarded on a professional level, not for actually doing anything important, not for creating, but for bringing in resources to the institution. Obviously, you can see why, as a president of a school, you'd reward one over another. It's a much safer bet to say, get a 300 grand DARPA grant than it is invent cold fusion, right? One of those is a much surer bet than the other. And I think that, when we bring up that term managerialism, I think it's important to realize that the same management techniques you see in the corporate world are effectively used everywhere. That is the kind of like predominant social technology at the moment. And so, it is the same reason that, companies like HP tend to kind of initially be very, innovative, produce great things, and then kind of slide into mediocrity where they're sort of minorly innovating, not even innovating, minorly like derivating on their initial ideas. That's just kind of the way institutions go. I will say I find this personally irritating because people who self-describe themselves as academics, in current year are generally unimpressive people. And they sort of get to kind of skate by on the cultural cachet attached to a PhD, whereas that, and I think it is probably catching up soon, much the same way that it happened to, an undergrad degree. But a 2022 PhD is not the same thing as a 1920 PhD. And I think that, again, part of this, and I don't mean to just kind of ramble at you, but I think part of it is as we have universalized education, again, you're just playing with a larger part of the population pyramid. And so if all of a sudden, I think it's like roughly, let's just say between 30 and 40% of people my age are going or have gone to college. Okay, it doesn't matter how smart your society is. The top 30% is nowhere near as intelligent as the top 5%. Taking aside what Dutton would say or others would say about kind of genetic degradation, just based on like simple statistics, you are not going to be able to produce an elite that is the top third. It's just not the same.
Right. Yeah. It's so there's a number of things in there. Right? Like it has become a different thing. I think in the past, like these PhDs, it really did mean a lot. And I think a lot of times people are getting advice from people who were acting on it 30 years ago. And if you were living 600 years ago, that advice that they gave you would probably be still pretty good. But with the rate of technological advance, the momentum of shifting is moving so quickly that people are still doing things based on very, very old advice. It takes a long time for this type of thing to catch up. And I don't know if I'm making my point well here, but the people still getting PhDs, there is a level of cultural appreciation for that, but it's very like, it is very diminished. It's been even more diminished in the last 10 years, quite a bit. And there are these new markers, right? So then there's people like us that have audiences. You obviously have a larger audience than me, but my audience is like, it's relatively small, but relatively small means like 1,000. So like at a minimum. So it's like, that's a lot of people. And this is allowed for by the internet. So not only does culture shifts and it changes and it's dynamic in response to many different things, but environment is one of them, both human and physical. And our technology that we have is part of our environment because it affects the way that we interact with the world. And so today, when you have like the expansion of the internet since the 1990s, and you have the potential for guys like us, I think you also just have an undergrad degree, right?
Yeah, that's all I have. I have an undergrad. Actually,
Right.
even worse, I have an associate's degree and an undergrad degrey. So I didn't even do it the real way.
It's fine. It doesn't matter because it doesn't matter because your ideas stand on their own because you have an audience, and my ideas stand on my own because I have an audience. So like, these academics, like sometimes I argue with PhDs on the internet, and they have very, very like they have these pompous attitudes, and they look down on people like me and you a lot, and in my experience on me specifically, but they don't produce anything. They earn money from usually a university, usually not that much. They don't get paid very well in most cases. Obviously a tenured professor will, but those positions are very small. There's not very many of them. They're giving out less and less, and they're creating more and more PhDs. So they exist in this state where they have this cultural prestige of the institution and the piece of paper that they have, and people do look up to that, but it doesn't produce anything material, which is not everything, of course, but do you get what I'm saying?
No, I 100% do. And, a little over a year ago, I got kind of soft doxxed by a person that I know in real life who absolutely flipped his shit when he found out about my podcast. And this guy is a PhD academic. And in this like kind of rant that he posted, the phrase that you see over and over and over through it is, well, one, dangerous, but two, pseudo academic, right? And obviously, I don't want to turn this into kind of my personal drama, but to me, I sort of feel the same way about that term as I do about racism or about any other things, which is basically like, I deny you the moral high ground in that, right? Like if your system of academia in the year 2024 was so great, so amazing, surely we would see it in its fruit. And so that term pseudo academic, it's like, well, what the hell does that mean, right? Does it mean not officially licensed? Okay, yes, I own that. I agree. Does it mean uninteresting? I don't think so, because it goes back to your point. Like there is an audience for the things that you and I say. And obviously, being popular does not mean it is good. There are any number of things which are quite popular, like I think Fast and Furious X, which is not exactly a quality film. But nonetheless, right, there is something to be said for the fact that like traditional academia is no longer the best game in town. Certainly it still has some prestige attached to it. I think that is fast disappearing. But if you're actually interested in ideas, if you're interested in doing the work, right, the legwork of that used to be kind of confined to the university setting, well, there's a better place and a better way to do that. And I think that, again, I'm by no means a populist, but when I look at what people like you and I do, and admittedly, this is kind of an unstructured conversation, but if you're looking for hours and hours and hours of university level long form content on the internet, there are hundreds of people willing to offer it to you for free or a small fee. And so again, that doesn't give you the credentials, right? No matter how many, apostolic majesty videos you watch on, the Byzantines, that does not get you a degree. But again, we're talking about around this idea that, these universities convey prestige. And I think that's going away. And we very clearly ventured away from those as being primarily, educational institutions. And I think that part of this is, and the conservatives need to own this, right? That higher education was basically an economic cheat code for a while. And so we still view it in those terms. And you even see that in the way people talk about getting educated, right? Like getting an education, like it's something you can purchase or kind of grab hold of. Whereas a more classical understanding was that an education, one, is sort of a lifelong process, and two, it is something you earn, right? It is something you have to work at. No one can make you educated. And so, again, when we look at the period at which, sciences, particularly the social sciences, were doing interesting things, right? It is a time in which there were a great number of illegitimate scholars, right? They were certainly well educated, they were certainly smart men, but no one's sitting there asking like, okay, yeah, sure, you've discovered this new tribe, but where's your PhD? Sure, you've done this thing, sure, you've gone to this place, but where's your PhD? And I think it really is putting the cart before the horse to get so tied up in credentialism. And once you sort of interact with people who do have these, credentials, these gold stars, and then on the converse, people who are much more interesting, much more intelligent, who have no credentials at all, sort of the scales fall away from your eyes and you realize that, okay, maybe this system did have a purpose, but the purpose it is serving is no longer the one it was set up to do. And I mean, if someone came up to you and said, I have, a gold star, it probably would be a red star, I guess, from the Soviet Commissar because I'm the best at Soviet science, you'd look at them very differently than if they said, I'm a premier, PhD in cultural anthropology. But I think that difference is fast disappearing. So sorry, Sam, I didn't mean to just rant at you for 10 minutes, but I guess that's kind of my feelings on the issue.
No, absolutely. We're completely on the same page. Yeah, and it's like, I feel like I don't know, I wasn't there, but 60 years ago, I bet that the real PhDs back then that were doing really incredible work, if somebody today who has a PhD, who I literally was having this conversation last night, I was commenting back and forth with people, if they were to not argue their ideas and refuse to argue their ideas and say instead on an open forum that like, oh no, she or he has the PhD, so they're right. I think that the PhDs from 60, 70 years ago, the real ones would be like, that's not how this works. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe they would have this haughty attitude of superiority, but it's ridiculous to me that the underlying beliefs of ideas standing on their own and the underlying like reasons for the scientific method, even in soft social science, are just gone. And so on prestige, right? So I don't think the prestige is disappearing. I think that the prestige is always contextual. So like you said, right? If you have a degree from a Soviet university, that might not be the same as today. That might not carry the same prestige in the United States. But that's because prestige is contextual. In the same way that in certain Papua New Guinea tribes, their form of value is the amount of pigs that a man owns. In the Kalahari, it's the amount of cows that you have. For the Apache, the Plains Indians, it was the amount of horses that you have. And there are all these different methods of understanding in a specific culture what brings prestige. And even within a culture, there are different levels of prestige. So when I'm on my MySpace on Twitter, when I'm on Frog Twitter, Dissident Right Twitter, Libertarian Twitter, when I'm on these Twitter groups, these spheres that I'm a part of, the ways that prestige is decided is based on merit. It's based on the quality of people's ideas. It's based on like people being on the right side sometimes, even having the right opinion to be less charitable. But once you go out of that, like when I start talking to PhDs like I was doing last night, it doesn't matter the argument that I'm making because they decide prestige and they decide how they view who is in the right and who is in the wrong under a different lens. Everything that you get is created, and this is Thich Nhat Hanh, the late Vietnamese Mahayana Buddhist monk. Things are created twice, once in reality and once in your mind. Everything passes through the filter of your cultural understanding of the world based on your experiences. So when I'm talking to PhDs who are in their other context and their little vote blue no matter who Ukraine LGBTQ alphabet flags in their profile, they're going to decide that the PhD is right, even though I'm telling them I took this image from her paper. This is the data in her paper. The data shows that Tom Roswell is correct in what he's saying. It says it right here in the evidence from her paper. And the comment I get back is the audacity to explain a paper to the author of the paper. No, I'm looking at the evidence. I'm explaining the evidence. The evidence is in my face. I have an undergrad degree. That is good enough to interpret data, even if we are going to appeal to authority. You could learn how to interpret data on your own. You don't need an undergrad degree, but that is what an undergrad degree originally was for. It was to interpret these liberal arts things. So yes, that is to say that prestige is contextual, and with the new technology, the new environment that we have, there is this new thing where for us, it doesn't matter if I don't have a PhD. People still give me $2 a month on Patreon, which is all I ask. I don't ask you $15,000 like a university education, or we'll say a class, which is like $900.
I'll put it this way. I also have a buy me a coffee link. And if someone wants to give me $15,000, I'll sell out. I'll say whatever you want. Anyway, sorry, but back to the point at hand. This is actually something that I kind of bully conservatives about. And you see this with the Daily Wire recently had a media event, right? They had some kind of movie coming out with Gina Carano, the ex-WWE wrestler. And so what they did is they held sort of a mock red carpet event. And they sort of aped the forms of Hollywood. And to me, I look at that as going about it all wrong, right? Because you were adopting, you're still living within the prestige hierarchy of your explicit enemies, right? You want to do the things that they do to be cool and hip and to get prestige. And I see that as being completely backwards because, again, right, you don't control those things. You were appealing to an outside authority who explicitly hates you and disagrees with you. And so what you see is, if you're chasing someone else's version of prestige in a political context, they control you. They lead you around by the nose. And this is very easy to see in figures like David French, right? Like David French has basically come out as an out-and-out Democrat now. He's kind of shed all pretensions of being, a good principled Christian conservative. But how did that happen, right? Well, effectively, the left in America pulled hard on his prestige instinct. Like, you don't want to support this new nasty Republican Party. Only gross, weirdo deplorables do that. The good ones, right? And you're one of the good ones, David, aren't you? They're more moderate. They believe that, okay, maybe we shouldn't have abortion, but really the real danger is fascism or racism and all these things. And so by kind of controlling that disgust versus prestige mechanism, right, which is very human, right? That's how humans organize themselves. Because that's outsourced, they control the direction of your life. And either you have to be extraordinarily disagreeable, which is, I think, how most people end up here where we are, or create your own value hierarchy in its stead. And so I think that, and I realize, like, I don't want to take this entirely into R's versus D politics, but if we're talking about, a way to sort of get out from under that system, you have to realize that you can't oppose a system and be viewed as prestigious by it. You kind of have to choose one or the other. And so look, like what you and I are doing, your point about prestige and being contextual is very right. Because, if I went back to my professors and said, hey, look, I'm an anonymous internet racist, they would be aghast. They'd be like, what the hell are you doing? Whereas, if I do that among my friends, they're like, great, I like that. That's good. Keep doing it. My audience would say the same thing. And so I think that if we're looking for a path forward kind of out of our current like clown world, it is going to involve the engineering or the building of a new prestige hierarchy.
Yes. But unfortunately, I think for a number of reasons, love everything you said. But using the Daily Wire as an example, when you live in a culture where the reality of the legal reality is that when you create an institution and it grows to a certain size, I think over 25 employees, then that institution has to abide by a extensive list of regulations, including ones related to the Civil Rights Act. And so when the Civil Rights Act and then the additions to it. And when you have to work within that, it means that the socially constructed corporations, which are, I think that social constructs can be compared even between, like, you can compare the legislative branch of the US government and a company. Like, you can do that. Apples and oranges are still fruit. They can still be compared. And when you take those institutions and they have to abide by certain rules to exist, the result of that incentive structure is that the organizations, either they get destroyed by lawsuits, lawfare, or they censor themselves, they change themselves, and they abide by the rules that they have to. So there's effectively a shifting over time of these institutions, and I think that's effectively what's happening with the Daily Wire. It's hard to point to specific aspects of it, but we know for a fact that companies are required by regulations to abide by a laundry list of regulations, like pages and pages and pages and hundreds of pages of these things that they have to abide by. And that changes an institution. And if they try to fight it, they're diminished because they will have less money, because they're putting money towards fighting this, and they will be, if not destroyed, diminished in their effect. And so yes, sure, we have to create new institutions, but those institutions themselves will be under attack, and there might be some sort of ceiling on them. For example, Candace Owens, shout out to my queen, Candace Owens, who is right now under attack at the Daily Wire and is being threatened very literally by a man of God, apparently, who sells sex products with his daughter, that she will be bankrupt by his lawyers. Explicitly, she's being accused of that. And that's the type of thing that happens when you try to exist outside of a established prestige hierarchy, officially, when people don't want you to do what you're doing. So yes, we need to do that. We are doing that in certain ways, but there's a limit on the effect that we can have doing that in the contemporary situation, nationally and in general.
Well, you're 100% right there. And I think that is, again, this is why, Bog Beef is 100% right, that effectively the Civil Rights Act is the boss. That's the thing you have to attack. And, it's not because I'm sort of this, I'm not, sitting behind my microphone here in a Klansman hood. It's not because I'm really excited, ready to go to bring Jim Crow back. But it's because of things like that, HR, things like all of these essentially government mandated commissars that have to be installed at any institution of a significant size. And what that basically means is that if you're building anything, if you're good at it, you get through the bottleneck, you're a successful, startup founder. Well, you've got to have one of their men, or let's be honest, their women inside your castle, right on the inside, basically reporting. And I think it's interesting.
Sorry to interrupt, but the venture capital, I spoke to Bog Beef about this on my own show, and Marbleck, I spoke to the good old boys. Venture capital now is infiltrated by DEI and ESG. All of the large venture capital firms, all the new companies coming up right now will from the very beginning have these things built into them rather than them being added over time. So they will be much more powerful in their expression of DEI and ESG type things. But apologies.
Well, certainly. And if we look at where, people like, Thiel and Musk are sort of coming at the similar issues that we are. And I don't think those guys are our guys. I don't think, although I would certainly accept Thiel bucks, I don't think that we agree on the ideal end state society. What I do see is that's a group of powerful people who are looking at this core problem. And it's their final boss is the same thing as ours. And that is the civil rights regime. Because again, right, much like education, if your purpose deviates from producing the best, right? And if you're a tech company, right, it's, basically employing the best minds possible to, supporting a DEI kind of patchwork, right? That makes it much more difficult when you're trying to achieve the nth percentile of success. And so I see that as a hopeful thing, right? That we at least have, if not friends, we have a powerful group with mutual enemies. And again, right, you're 100% right about that as being a problem. And I think that if we're talking about like orders of operation, your triage list, that's close to the top of actually building anything to get out of this. But maybe that's a discussion for another time. So Sam, we're coming up on time. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Illegitimate Scholar, it's on YouTube. Weekly interview podcast. I had on Bog Beef. I have on a wide range of people on there. But Illegitimate Scholar podcast, some of my old episodes I just relaunched with interviews at episode 50 are other stuff. They're like audio essays. And then I do live streams on YouTube sometimes. So, Illegitimate Scholar anywhere, just Illegitimate Scholar, you type it in, you'll find me. I have some extra stuff on my Patreon, which is $2 a month. But yeah, please, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, any of those, and ill_scholar on Twitter.
Well, definitely, man, this was a great conversation. I can't recommend your podcast enough. I've been listening to it in prep for this episode, and I've really been enjoying it. As far as my stuff, appreciate that. Oh yeah, definitely. As far as my stuff, you can find me on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also check out my sponsor, and I guess actually, Illegitimate Scholar, you're also with Axios, correct?
Oh yeah. So I haven't officially announced that yet, but it's not a secret that I'm sponsored by Axios now, fitness company. So me and Jay Burden are in a fitness group chat together now. Which is basically just people
making fun of each other for being too weak to lift weights, which is kind of fun, right?
Yeah. Lots of Zen posting as well. Yeah.
All right. And again, thank you so much for coming out, man. This was a great time. And to everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.